The use of individual incentive schemes is often assumed to be quite a new innovation within organisations, particularly as it's associated with the use of merit pay schemes, lump sum bonuses, and so on. These new versions of variable pay schemes that are often being seen on the one hand by their fans as being one of those silver bullets that organisations can solve all of their problems with, and by their detractors as evidence of an aggressive management style that is used to shift the burden of risk within organisations from the employer to employees. So it's a controversial area and often seen as a relatively new area, but we've seen varieties of individual incentive schemes within organisations, almost as long as modern organisations have existed. So we're just going to run through some different varieties of individual incentive schemes and think about how each of them operates. So we'll start with some of the more recent schemes, with merit pay schemes and with lump sum bonuses. Now, merit pay schemes have all kinds of variations in the way in which they operate. But broadly, the idea of a merit pay scheme is that an assessment is done of an employee's level of performance in a given period of time, and that a pay increase, an uplift on their base pay is applied depending upon what that level of performance has been. Now, of course, there are all kinds of different ways that we can determine the level of performance, and those different mechanisms, different methodologies of doing that will have an impact upon the way in which the merit pay scheme itself works. Sometimes it will be built into the normal system of performance appraisal, performance management. Sometimes organisations will have a kind of multi-step approach whereby managers make recommendations, and then it goes further up the organisation. Then maybe there's a consideration about how performance is distributed across the whole organisation. Sometimes organisations are more focused around the forced distribution of performance levels, so that within a team there has to be somebody in the top 10%, there has to be somebody in the bottom 10%, even if everybody is performing well or acceptably. There has to be the identification of who is the worst and who is the best and where other people sit. And sometimes these kinds of approaches end up being quite controversial in themselves. But in essence, there's an evaluation of an employee's performance by a manager, so it gives individual managers a great degree of power that they would not typically have had in more traditional approaches of pay determination, where there's simply a rate of pay for the job. So this is one of the reasons why unions aren't very big fans of this kind of approach. And once that evaluation of performance has been made, then that gets applied to a level of pay increase. Now, there are various design decisions on the pay side of this equation. We talked about how there are different approaches to the evaluation of performance, but then what do you do with it? In terms of pay terms. What do you do with somebody, say, who is performing well below average? Do they get any kind of pay increase? What should the gap be between someone who's performing well below average and someone who's performing well above average? What should the role of average pay be? How should that be rewarded? Because most people are always going to be average. So what do you do with them? How much do you want to differentiate between people who are doing perfectly fine and doing what is expected of them and the stars? How much do you want to stretch these kinds of schemes. If you don't stretch them enough, does that provide sufficient motivation for someone to be able to want to put in the required effort in order to be one of those stars? Is it incentive enough, or should it be more generous at the top end? What are the implications for fairness and equity? What are the implications for checks and balances in terms of procedural justice? How does it work out in terms of how fair the process is to have an individual manager determining these important aspects of performance and therefore pay? So there are all kinds of issues around the way that these systems work, the different approaches that we can take towards them, and the implications on how that translates through into performance levels and how they're regarded in terms of fairness and whether that results in dissatisfaction in turn. Lump sum bonuses are broadly similar. There's a determination of performance and a degree of reward that's applied in relation to that. The difference to lump sum bonus is that this is simply a one-off bonus. That at the end of the period, at the end of the year, whatever it is, then an amount of money will be supplied. It doesn't become part of your base pay. It doesn't uplift your base pay and then all of the other things that within rewards that depend upon base pay, like your receipt of benefits and all other kinds of things, your pension and so on. It's simply a pot of money that you're given, and then if you don't perform to the same degree the following year, well, you're back to square one. So lump sum bonus is, in terms of transfer of risk from employer to employee, it's even riskier form of incentive scheme than merit pay schemes might be, because whatever we might think about the way in which performance levels are determined and the fairness of all of those kind of things, at least once you've got it, you get to keep it. It gets rolled into your base pay, and then that becomes the next basis upon which the consideration for future years is determined. More traditional forms of incentive plans have taken on a variety of different forms, and they tend to be split between approaches which use units of production as the basis of how much the rate of pay should be, so how much stuff do you produce, and schemes which determine how much you get on how quickly you work. So they use time period per unit of production as the basis for calculation of how much you should get as an incentive. We also see some distinction between schemes where the relationship between what you do and what you get is held constant. So if you work this much harder or this much faster, then that will result in this much extra pay being awarded. And schemes which have more of a variable relationship. So if you work a certain amount harder or faster, then you get so much more. But if you work even at a different rate harder or faster, then that impact upon reward might be disproportional. So you achieve a higher level of production or a higher level of time efficiency, and you get even more generous incentives. So they use the schemes in various ways to try and deliberately target particular types of performative outcomes. So probably the most straightforward form of individual incentive plan is the so-called straight piecework plan. So piecework schemes are based around production, how much work you do in a certain period of time. And there's a standard set that up to this amount of production, how many units per hour or per day or whatever, then this will be the rate of pay that applies. So for example, it may be that the the normal rate of production that's expected would be 10 units of something per hour. And anything up to that guarantees a certain hourly rate of pay. But if you go beyond that, then you start to attract additional incentives. Say, for example, if you were to achieve 20 units per hour, then your rate of pay becomes effectively £10 per hour, because they're going up in additional increments. You're being recognised for the additional work that you do. The standard rate of pay is 50 pence per unit per hour, and because you're doing 20 rather than the 10 as standard, then you get £10 per hour. 30 units an hour, you get £15 an hour. But the relationship between these performance gains and the incentives that they attract are standard, that they're held common. We see different varieties of this kind of scheme, so where there's a more differential approach put in place. So, for example, the Taylor rate would have a couple of different cut-off points so that you can attract additional rates of pay per hour per unit if you hit very high levels of production. So similar to a piece rate plan, say you're getting 50 pence per unit per hour, based around anything up to 10, as in the piece work scheme. But above that, not only do you get the extra pay per unit per hour, as you have been getting, but the rate that you attract for everything over the standard is at a higher rate, say at 70 pence per unit, rather than the 50 pence, so that you're incentivized even harder, even further, to work that little bit higher. The merit rate works in a similar way, but with further distinctions within it. So it's based around incentivizing people based upon their production of something, their ability to work and produce outputs in a certain period of time, but vary in the way in which they apply the rates of pay in relation to this. The other approaches that we see in individual incentive plans, rather than being based around how many units of production per time period, they kind of switch the relationship around. So here it's about the time period that is required for a unit of production. So typically this would be the kind of work where it's not factory production line stuff where you've got lots of small tasks that are going through, but rather longer tasks. And so the appropriate unit of measurement would be how long is it going to take to do this thing. So, so if you were doing a more of a complete job, servicing a car, for example, we're usually thinking about how long this piece of work is going to take, and we work on the basis of a kind of standard a standard hour plan for something like that, so that if you were able to complete that work faster, and you get the payment that has been predicted for how long that job should take, but you can then move on to your next job and start to accumulate work and pay for that as well. And then we can see different kinds of approaches towards this, similar to the Taylor and Merrick schemes, where they distinguish between the way in which additional payment might be split between employer and employee, depending on how fast these kinds of jobs can be completed. So the Halsey 50-50 approach, for example, sees a 50-50 split between the employer and employee when they're able to move to complete a job faster than was predicted by the standard approach.